Hello, welcome to the introduction to SNOMED CT at Expo. Those that are online, you'll be able to communicate with us by using the Q&A box, so you can ask questions via that, and we'll look at those and answer them at the end of the presentation. Anybody in the room, we have a microphone again, so if you have questions at the end, we'll come around with the microphone so those people online can ask those questions. So today we're going to do an introduction to SNOMED CT. My name is Spiers. I'm a terminology education specialist at SNOMED International, and my colleague Kath will also introduce herself later, and she's doing the other half of the presentation. So let's get into what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover why SNOMED CT. What is SNOMED CT? Some key features about SNOMED CT. So a lot of the time people talk about concepts, descriptions, relationships. We'll explain what those are. How to customize and extend in SNOMED CT. So we'll be covering that, but just to give you a brief overview, SNOMED International publishes a terminology, but then the member countries can also extend that and have their own extensions. So we'll cover that. And then we're going to have a look at implementation of SNOMED CT, benefits of SNOMED CT, talk a little bit about SNOMED International and how to learn more. So let's go on to the next, which is why SNOMED CT. So if we think about it, it's a natural progression from sort of paper records originally in books to medical information that were classically in envelopes that were paper, all the way to electronic health records. So the way data is stored that's relevant to healthcare has changed over a period of time. But with that, clinical practice has had dependencies. And as we improve clinical practice, we are more and more dependent on the data that's entered by clinicians. And as part of that, you may get data from different sources, and you might want some automatic processing of that data. So it's not always about just being able to read it, but from computers to be able to understand it. So we'll talk a little bit about how SNOMED CT is organized. So it is structured and logically designed not only to have terms, but have meaningful data that computers can use as well. So when we look at the data in this current day, the information needs to be collected and understandable for both humans and machines. So there's a lot of data, and we'll show how SNOMED CT as a one language healthcare enables linkage and also usage that means that you can reuse the information. So the idea for a clinician may be that they would enter it once, but it can be reused many times rather than having to re-enter that data time and time again. And to do with that, data now, there's a lot of information stored in many different systems. And you need to be able to process that. So if you're a clinician again, you might want relevant information coming to you when you're treating that patient that's specific to that patient, such as decision support, knowledge linkages. So you may be looking at a particular condition and you might want the latest guidance on that condition. And also interoperability. So interoperability is really important in terms of we have many systems within a hospital environment, within primary care, within social care, within mental health, and those systems should be able to speak amongst themselves and not just be isolated. So it's that sharing of information. And I think one of the classic things in terms of interoperability that would be an everyday event, if someone has an accident and has to go to an ER department, but they can't speak, you can't ask them questions, you really want to get that data about that person so you can give them the best care. So that, I think, is a really good example of where, you're relying on data that's been recorded past, and you can't just go and ask that person those questions. So we move on to SNOMED CT. So SNOMED CT is a standardized clinical terminology. It has the ability to use other languages, and we'll touch on this later, how it does this. But what it enables us to do is take clinical data, make it meaningful. So each concept, and we'll talk about what concepts are, has meaning behind it. It's not just a term, it's structured in such a way that it has meaning, and it's interoperable and actionable. So what is SNOMED CT? Well, it's the most comprehensive multilingual clinical healthcare terminology in the world. But we'll go into a little bit more about the details of that later on. But just to cover how much usage, it's used in more than 80 countries already. And sometimes people are not aware they're using SNOMED CT within their systems. In the UK, it's used in primary and secondary care. In America here, there are huge incentives to use SNOMED for payments, meaningful use, and those sort of things. And in Australia, it's used throughout healthcare, but it's also used in many other countries as well. Those are just a few examples. So when we have a clinical terminology like SNOMED, what are the key things that we need it to meet in terms of requirements? Well, one of those is being able to enter and display. So being able to have good terms that you can enter that are not ambiguous, that are understandable. So once they're put in and someone looks at them, they'll still be able to understand what was meant at that time. And obviously being able to be displayed, so later on you can look at the history of what's been recorded. On top of that, it's really important within hospital settings now and primary care settings to be able to run reports and analyze, so to be able to send referral notes to people or send them reminders when they need to come in. All those type of things will run off reports. And so you need to be able to analyze the data, be able to get at it, and allow computer processing to cut that down and be able to do the reports that you need. And also reporting is often important in terms of incentives, payments, those sort of things. So there's a lot of reporting that goes on in healthcare. The other key thing is decision support. And I'll give you an example of that if someone has an allergy to penicillin, you want your system to say this person is allergic. So when you go to try and prescribe penicillin, it says, no, this person's allergic. So how do you do that? If your data is not just words, but meaningful, then you can use the modeling of SNOMED to enable that to happen. And obviously, we've talked about sharing and communicating, so that's really important. And I think now, more globally, it's more important to try and get that country-to-country data sharing as well. So if you're on holiday and you have an accident or something, and they can get hold of data from your country, it may not be exact, but it may give a good indication of the key things that you have, and therefore you get treated carefully. So SNOMED, what does it cover? Well, it's not just diagnosis. It has a broad set of meanings. So it has domains to cover diseases and clinical findings like signs and symptoms. It has surgical, therapeutic, diagnostic procedures. So you have findings, you have procedures, you have observations, body structures, organisms, substances, pharmaceutical products, so you have medicinal products, physical objects, physical forces, specimens. There are 19 hierarchies, so it's not just disorders, it has a lot more. And all these things are useful in healthcare. It's not just knowing whether someone's got a fracture of foot. It might be also worth knowing that that person has a learning disability, or that they have they didn't come into appointment because they don't go out so much. All that sort of social determinant stuff is in SNOMED as well. So it's not just about diagnosis. It's a lot more than that. So SNOMED is broad. It's a global clinical terminology. At the moment, it has about just over 350,000 unique concepts in 19 different hierarchies. So we talked about those different aspects, so procedures, clinical findings. But what's also unique about it is it has many levels. So if you want to use very specific data, you can, but it has more broader data as well. So it depends what the clinician actually finds out and knows. You can record that sort of information. So it's, if it's just at a higher level that I know that they have an arrhythmia, then you could log that. But then you might be able to find out more about that patient as you go on, and specifically choose a concept underneath that that's more specific to what condition. So it has, the group has allow more general sort of concepts to be added, but then you have more specific. And one thing that's really important about SNOMED CT is that it's updated and released monthly. And a good example where that's useful is during the COVID outbreak, where we have new vaccines, we have new conditions, we had a new pandemic, we had new viruses, we had things related to COVID. And to enable people to react to that and start putting that data in systems and monitoring it, it's really, really important that you can react that quickly to be able to have terms and codes that you can use the next month within your systems. So I think that was a good example where this quick release of data that we do, you know, we do have good quality data as well. So it's not like it doesn't go through the same process. It goes through process, but instead of doing it 6 monthly or yearly, when we've done a certain amount of work, we release it. So it's continuously being released throughout the year. The history of SNOMED CT is based on past terminologies. So we didn't start with SNOMED CT wasn't the first terminology, and it was an amalgamation of READ within the UK and SNOMED RT within the US. But from that, when we used those terminologies and they were still being used, we learned a lot of things that they couldn't do, or issues that were unseen at the time those terminologies started. And we found that we needed to improve on that. So SNOMED CT was designed to meet the user requirements, practical experience, and scientific principles on top of those past terminologies. And there was a key paper published by James Cimino, and why it was good is it set out 12 conditions that a terminology should meet to enable it to be a good clinical terminology. And this was from all the past experience that then we could think about it and say, I wish your terminology could do this, and it must be able to do that. And SNOMED meets all those requirements. So in its design, we learned from the past, we created a better terminology for the future. And I touched on quality. The content that goes into SNOMED, there's expert review. We have people with clinical backgrounds, also terminologists, so international personnel, but we also collaborate with people outside. So we have working groups, we have experts in the different areas that can advise us what's the best way of saying things, the way of structuring the data. I think what's quite unique as well is we have transparency in terms of there's an editorial guide. So you can actually see how we create these things. We're very transparent. If we make changes, we tell people, we explain it, we go to we would have a briefing note if we made a change and let the community come back to us and feedback before we make that change. So we're very collaborative. And just to be aware as well, the data we release, it's consistent in the fact that we have a set of rules, and the quality of the content goes through validation and pattern evaluation. So we pick up any common mistakes through that process as well. So what are the key features of SNOMED CT? Well, you often will hear in this expo the word concept, maybe description, relationship. Those are the sort of three components that are sort of the foundation of what SNOMED CT is. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time going through each one of those so you can fully understand when we say a concept, what do we mean by a concept? So a concept in its simplicity is a clinical thought. So say, for example, lung disease. I think of it as lung disease in my language. Someone else may have a different term for that in their language, but we're thinking about the same thing. So that clinical thought, that's what a concept is. And to that thought, we add a unique code. So the unique code to the concept. So a concept has a unique code. And then what we do is that concept just doesn't exist by itself, but it has relationships to other concepts as well. So for in this case, you can see that it has a relationship to 4 other concepts. And the lines, you can see there's a code on there as well. So a computer might be able to understand that, but humans also need to be able to understand that. So although we have this logical definition between concept and concept, when we start putting terms on that, it starts making a bit more sense. So in this case, the concept we're considering here is a type of disorder of lung, is a lower respiratory tract infection. It has a pathological process of infectious process. It has a finding site of lung structure. So you might wonder, well, what is the concept? Well, the concept is infectious disease of lung. And you can see that it's been defined by those other concepts. So again, this is useful for computers to understand and also for analysis. So if I say, give me all the lung diseases, this will be returned because it's been modeled as having a finding site of lung. So you can use these attributes and pick them out and pull back searches that have those properties. So it pulls back the concept. But what's key here is that in terms of the human readable bit, we have what's called the FSN, which is a long sort of unambiguous name in brackets with a semantic tag that sort of tells you which hierarchy it's in. But then we have a number of synonyms, and not even to do with languages, but in common practice, people will use different words to mean the same thing. So we have to acknowledge that. And when you go searching for something, you should be able to search on any of those terms, but come back to the original concept. That's what's going to be recorded, but you should be able to search on those different terms to get to that point. And we'll come to languages in a minute, but you can imagine you can have those terms in different languages, and you can decide which is your preferred term, which ones are acceptable, and you could also decide which ones you don't want to include, and I'll explain how that's done in a while. So we have these 19 hierarchies. So the key thing about each of those hierarchies is that we have this is-a relationship. And this is a simple case where you can see that A has an is-a relationship to B. So that means that A is a type of B. So you can imagine as you go up the hierarchy, the concept that's a child is a type of the parent and is a type of the grandparent, and it goes all the way up. So, but to explain that a little bit more, we'll look at an example. So we have here fracture of femur, and that's a type of fracture of lower limb, which is a type of fracture of bone. And then in the body structure hierarchy, where we have the finding site associated that uses the body structure concept, we have bone structure of femur, bone structure of lower limb, and bone structure. So each of the two hierarchies, and you can see the way the concepts are being mapped across with finding site. But what's really good is you get logical inference. So fracture of femur is not just type of fracture of lower limb, it's also a fracture of bone. So you can imagine that if I said, find all the patients I have with a fracture of bone, all their subtypes, all the ones that should be subtypes of that would come back because there's this inference. So when we normally state it in a terminology, it looks like it's just a child-parent relationship. But in fact, if you start higher up and say, give me all the descendants, it will give you all those descendants. So again, for querying, that's really powerful because often you want to pull back a sort of broad level set of conditions for those patients, and it will. But you can go into more detail. So you could say, give me someone with a particular finding site and give me someone with a particular pathological process. So you could get quite complex, and we'll touch on that later, but that's called ECL, where you can use the data here to structure what type of data you get returned. The best way for an introduction, so I've talked about this, but when you go away and you want to have a look at this, have a look at the browser. The browser is really good because you can look at these hierarchies, you can look at the concepts. You may know of someone with a particular condition or something you are more aware of. Go and search for the term, see how it sits in the hierarchy. Concepts generally have parents. Every concept must have at least one parent, as in it must sit in the hierarchy. In this particular case, the lung disorder has those two parents. We have the representation of the attributes it has, so the finding site, the pathological process. But underneath it, it has children, and those also have children. So you can see that it goes all the way down. So it's quite broad. So you generally look at concepts and see what's above and below, and you can go below or you can go above, however you want to look at the hierarchy. But they can go quite deep. So you can keep clicking on them and eventually get down to something. And right to the bottom, which is what we call a leaf node, which is at that time the lowest concept within that hierarchy. So you can view that. There's a browser available, and you can go and have a look at these concepts. One key thing about how we model things is we have a concept model. And you would look at this as a set of rules. So, for example, in the domain of clinical finding, we can have an attribute called finding site. But in the procedure hierarchy, we have something called procedure site. You can't use a procedure site against a clinical finding. You can't use a finding site against the procedure. You have certain attributes for certain domains because it doesn't make sense if you use them for the other domains. On top of that, you can only have certain values. So it's not like a random pick this attribute, pick this value, everything goes. It has to make sense in terms of the modeling. So we have this set of rules and guidance on how things are modeled. So in this particular case, and I think this makes sense, you have fracture of bone, and it can have a finding site of bone structure. That would be an acceptable way of modeling. But if I had fracture of bone and then put on it procedure approach, that would not make sense for that clinical finding. It would for a procedure, but you don't want that attribute on a finding. So we have a set of rules. And by having those set of rules, it enables then for it to make sense logically. And then when you go searching for the data, it's good quality data. There's no confusion about what's been stated. So how do we customize and extend SNOMED? Well, SNOMED International releases SNOMED International release. And there's international content within there. And as I talked about this morning, there's more than 350,000 concepts just in that. But you get the situation within member countries, let's say, for example, UK, that may have certain policies, certain local things that are only relevant to the UK and aren't relevant to anybody else. So how do they put all the local information in that they need for their healthcare systems? It belongs in SNOMED, but what part of SNOMED does it belong in? If you put it in the international, a lot of people would say, well, I've got information here I don't really need in my country. So the member countries can create their own concepts, descriptions, relationships, reference sets. We'll touch on those. You can customize SNOMED to enable you to achieve what you need to within your country. And drugs is a good example that sometimes drugs are marketed in one country but not in another. And therefore, if it goes in SNOMED International, it must have been okay to be used in a number of member countries, not just one specific member country. So how is this done? So you can have national and local content. And so you can have national, but in America, there is like Kaiser Permanente that have got their own extensions, so they can even do it locally rather than nationally. You can use it to whatever you need to. And you can add concepts, you can add those relationships, you can add descriptions. So in a particular setting, and we'll touch on this with the language, if you want to add further descriptions to those concepts, you can do it, but within your extension. They're not released internationally, but you put the two together, you take the international, you add your extension, and then you have what you need for your setting. And we'll touch on subsets, languages, and maps, and we have an ability to do that. The two things I want you to take away from this slide is one, that all SNOMED concepts, whether international or an extension, have a unique code. So there's no crossover, there's no reuse of code, everything is unique. And on top of that, if you wanted to have a look at the how much people have gone and done extensions, if you look on the right-hand side, those are all available in the browser at the moment. They're all the countries' versions of the extensions that happened, and as you can see, and they're not everything, but they're the ones that are available on the browser. You can see how many countries have gone down the road of extending SNOMED to meet their needs. And you can go into those browsers. If you know the languages, you can go and check them out, see how it differs from SNOMED International. Okay, so reference set. Sorry. Yeah. It's a generated tool, and the extensions use that as well. Yeah, what they have is called a namespace. So each of those, part of the code is a namespace specific to those countries or those extensions. So that part of the code is unique to them. Sorry, go on. Yeah. There is actually in the browser, you can see all extensions in one go. Yeah. There could be overlap in truth. And we try to encourage those countries, if they think they've got something in common, to get it promoted to SNOMED International, so that then, but yeah, those cases do, and they do work separately, but sometimes if there's something extension that they want to promote to SNOMED, they can. And they can even look at someone else's extension and say, can that be promoted? But they have to tell the extension user, because sometimes the extension user might still want to keep it within their system rather than go internationally for whatever reason they have. They may not want it to change, and they need to keep it in their extension. So reference sets are like a very unique way of taking components of SNOMED CT and doing some amazing things with them. So one of the things you might think of is maps. So you might want to map to SNOMED, might want to map SNOMED to some other standard. Reference sets can be used for that. They can also be used for subsets. So you might not want the whole of the procedure hierarchy. You might just want a particular part within that EHR system. So you can have a reference set that just takes those particular bits you want and create a reference set for it. So, and it's also good for management terminology changes, those sort of things. So let's just have a look at a few examples. So this is a simple reference set. It doesn't exist. It's just a simple reference set with a common cold, influenza, and viral tonsillitis. So you've picked those three things and forget about all the numbers, but you can see with the data, with the table, there are certain things that are stated like, is it active, what module, all those things. But the reality is when you look at the reference component ID, those are the three things that are in your reference set. So there you have a set of three. So why would we use reference sets? Well, for search and data entry, as I say, you might want a favorites list, or you may not want to see the whole of the terminology. You may only want to see certain parts of it. For information modeling and communications, and for data retrieval and analysis. So let's look at an example. So this again is a simple reference set, and we've picked certain concepts to go. Sorry, is it too small? Sorry, I apologize. You may want to pick certain items from the hierarchy to go into that reference set. But what's even more powerful with SNOMED is a lot of the time you don't want to just cherry pick those concepts. A lot of the time you may want to define what's in the subset by using a way of computing the data. And that's what we call ECL, expression constraint language. So I'm going to show you the next slide because you'll get it from the next slide rather than all these definitions. So do you see here we've got, and this is called an intentional reference set, where you use a query language to decide what's in your reference set. So rather than picking each individual one, in this case, we say, give us all disorders of a lung that has an associated morphology of edema. And it just runs away and finds all those concepts with that. So you can say, give me a particular concept and all its children, or give me some condition I want to define, and then populate your reference set using that query language. That's sometimes really useful because if the hierarchy changes over a period of time, you haven't got to go in and have a look and add another thing. As long as it's going to sit within your hierarchy, you can define what you would want within that reference set. And the next time the data is uploaded, it will compute it and it will pull in the new things that meet this condition. So it's quite powerful in that way that you may just set your scope and allow it to run every time there's a substrate. But you still may want to check it for inclusion. And the thing about this as well is you can include things, but you can also use it to not include things. So it's a good way of saying, I want all those things, but I don't want this. You can do a minus and then take certain things out. So it's quite powerful. And it's all based on the way SNOMED's modeled. So you can use that query language to pull back concepts, but you can also do it to create a list of things that you might need to use for a particular setting. Or, as Kath will touch on, in an information model, you might, in that particular slot, want it to decide what are the possible choices that you choose within your system. And you could use this powerful technique to decide that rather than have a list that you need to update all the time. You could have an expression. Well, you could have an ECL that would lead to which concepts go there. So we talked about language as well. So language preferences are really good, and we use reference sets for those. And you might think, well, why do you do that? Well, one, you might want, here's that concept again, but in different. So we've got Canadian French, we've got Norway there, we've got Netherlands, but all those countries with extensions do their own language reference sets. And they can set what is the preferred term. So they can say, this is what's commonly seen. They can also put synonyms for searching for those particular things, but they can also say what they don't want in a reference set. So they don't have to include everything. So if they don't want the English in there, they don't have to put it in there. It's their reference set. So they can use reference sets to decide. And you may even get dialects, or in the case of Canada, you might want English or French, and you might decide which state shows, or you may want both. You can do whatever you like. You're choosing what the end user uses. So I think that's powerful, that not only can you do translations, but you can also decide how that looks in your user interface from a national level. And we touched on mapping as well. Why is mapping important? Well, we know that not every system starts with SNOMED CT. If we started from today, we'd love every system to have SNOMED CT, but that's not always the reality. So you may be coming from a place where people have free text, and a lot of people have done natural language processing. So they go through that text and pull out what could be structured, and they use SNOMED on the end to say, here's a list of the concepts from that text that we want to pull out and say, yeah, it's the patient's got asthma, the patient's got this, the patient's got that. So there are systems that already do that. They'll take paper, they'll scan it, and they'll come up with a code list of what's been stated. And you can imagine it can be quite difficult, because they have to be clever that they're not talking about the patient's mother or the patient's father for that particular condition, but they got really, really good. So you may have text, you may also have local codes. So you've come up, before the terminology is there, you may have had your own local codes, developed your own vocabularies. You can use reference sets to map to SNOMED from those local codes. So we have many products. We've got one called Snap to SNOMED, which you can put your list in and you can use it to map to SNOMED. So it'll search for a similar thing within SNOMED, and you can map your local code to SNOMED code. And obviously as well, there's lots of standards, ICD-10, GMDN in terms of devices, CPT, ICDO, MEDRA, Orphanet. We collaborate with so many people, and we create maps from SNOMED to those things, because we realize that it's not just about SNOMED, it's how you can use it as a linkage system, either from your local codes to SNOMED or SNOMED to these things. So why would you use maps? Well, you might use them for data entry. So you may have an interface that then maps to SNOMED. So you may have your preferences of whether you want to use your local codes, but then map to SNOMED. Then there is reporting and analysis. So maps are very good for that classification. So mapping to, say, ICD-10. And I have to say that SNOMED was developed for clinicians to use. So it's not just like a classification. We don't have NOS or any of those things. We're specific about this is to be used by clinicians for patient care. And that's why we've got so many concepts. If you want to then classify that up or aggregate it, then you could link it to ICD-10, which would capture more of those specific statistic requirements. Knowledge linkage is another thing. So you might want to map to a knowledge resource. So say, for example, in the UK, there's a nice guidance. In US, you probably have other guidance. So when a clinician puts in a condition, he might want to know the latest guidance on how you treat that person. What drugs do you do? What action do you do? So you could link that to that knowledge source. We've touched on decision support as well, how important that is to clinicians these days. They want, if they go to prescribe something, they want the system to say, hold on a minute, if there's going to be an issue. and communication. So there's mapping to be able to communicate, share records. So you may be using a different system, but you may want to map it to SNOMED so it can be communicated to other systems that will also understand SNOMED. So there are many different variations of the use of SNOMED. You can use it natively, or you can use it as something you map to then be able to utilize it for all of its properties, like it can be analyzed, like it then can be mapped to other things. So it's sort of a bridge terminology as well. We're not forcing people to use it natively. You could just map to it and then utilize what's behind it. And obviously the classic is that a lot of systems do use other terminologies in the first place. So you may have to, if you don't go straight to SNOMED first, you may need to map your old system to SNOMED, start using that, and maybe eventually move fully to SNOMED. And I'll just give you an example of an easy map, really. Is a simple map, ICDO to concept, SNOMED concept. So on the left, you've got the ID and the term. To the right, you have the ICD code and the term. But in fact, maps, as you possibly know, for ICD-10 can be a bit more complicated. They may have rules, like the patient, you know, if it's a child, if it's an adult. We have ref sets that enable you to put the mapping rules in as well. So all that information isn't lost. There are particular reference sets for particular mapping purposes. So this is simple, but they can get a lot more complicated where they have more rows and more columns. So I'm going to move on to Kath now to talk about data exchange, implementation, benefits, and how you can learn more. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Kath Priest. I'm one of the education and product support specialists working in the education team with Ian. So like Ian said, we're just going to go through what SNOMED, about SNOMED CT and data exchange. So this is just a really brief overview. I will say there is a more in-depth session about sort of data exchange and SNOMED CT this afternoon, which is sort of, it's called Unlocking the Power of SNOMED CT Using Health. So this is just sort of a bit of an introduction to that here. So I think one of the main things, obviously, Ian said, he's covered the basic features and how it can be, but one of the things that really works well when you've got a good electronic health record is the successful exchange of that health information. And this might be whether you want to exchange it between hospital, through clinics, registries, and you're wanting to do that to sort of improve the quality of patient care, and even sort of reporting and analytics from that point of view. So it's really important to be able to get that right. So how is this information exchange? Well, there's lots of different formats that you can use to exchange healthcare data. We have sort of non-standard approaches that can be used like XML and JSON. They tend to be the more common format. And then there might also be sort of dedicated application program interfaces that are developed to help exchange this clinical information. But one of the key things is that there are standards that have been developed to help exchange this clinical information. And one of the main ones that obviously we know about is the health level 7. So they've got sort of different standards and formats that you can use to make sure there's that effective exchange of that clinical information. And I think one of the main ones that we tend to talk about a lot at the moment is the HL7 FHIR ones. So these are just sort of recommendations from a SNOMED CT perspective, that it doesn't really matter what format you would use to exchange that clinical information. There's always some key bits of information about SNOMED CT you would want to include in that message. So you would always want to include the SNOMED CT concept idea, so that code Ian was talking about. And you'd also want to include the display term that the user has seen when they've selected that code and they've inputted it into the patient's record. But you need that information to still then be understandable to the user on the other end, so they can see the display term, but how do they know where that's actually come from? So often in these message formats, we recommend that you use a URI for SNOMED CT, and this is what you can see on the screen, the snomed.info/SCT. So that should always be included in that message information, but also the version of which SNOMED CT substrate that's come from. So you can see the example in this URI is that it's got the version, and this one's the 31st of July 2021 version. So that kind of gives you that traceability of where that information's come from, because we know the terminology can be, it's changeable, it changes release to release, it's released every month. So some codes might be inactivated or replaced by other ones. So this gives you that information of where it's come from. There's a link on the bottom of the slide which gives you a bit more detail about this specification. So if you want to know more about that, that's there. And then this is just an example of sort of a fire resource for a message that we've got. So this is just a very basic overview, and we're looking at sort of a condition resource. So if you're wanting to send that information about, say this patient's got a problem of bacterial infection, we can see the code section, which we would include this information in. So in the coding fields there, you can see the systems highlighted as SNOMED CT. The version specified. So in this example, we're showing that it's the July 2016 version, and you can see the concept ID as well. And then the display value. In this case, I think it's the preferred term in the US edition, but then you can see at the bottom the text, which is what would have been seen by the user from that point of view. So this is just sort of an example of how this might be exchanged in that message. And like I said before, there'll be a lot more strategies about this in the tutorial this afternoon. So if you're interested in this, please attend that with Anna and Alejandro this afternoon. Now I just want to go through we've talked about the features, what you can do about customizing it, but the key thing is we want to get SNOMED CT implemented in sort of health records. And there are lots of stages when you're thinking about a SNOMED CT implementation. So we've got sort of the strategic stages where we're thinking about the adoption and planning of SNOMED CT. So you've made that decision, you want to adopt SNOMED CT, but what's the strategic processes that you're going to do? What's needed for that perspective? What tools, what services, what resources you might need? Then there's also the technical stages of implementing SNOMED CT. So this is where you might specify your requirements of what you want your SNOMED CT enabled system to be able to do, and whether you will be sort of procuring a new system or actually designing and developing a system or modifying existing systems that are there to incorporate SNOMED CT. And then you're looking at the more practical stages of an implementation, which is the actual deployment of the system, but also then the use. You want to always keep an eye on what's happening with your implementation, getting feedback from users and making any improvements from any recommendations that they've been there. And I think the main thing that I want to go through from this is that there are resources and tools out there that can support you in these implementation stages that are really useful to use. So one of the key things, certainly from a strategy point of view, so whether you're an organization or a region or even a local organization, there is something that we call the SNOMED CT implementation roadmap generator. And this can help you bring together all your thoughts of your implementation roadmap. Once you know about your you want to adopt it, the planning, this gives you a starting point to get everything documented on paper. And there's actually sort of sample text that you can use to sort of state the background of the implementation, what the vision of that implementation is. And if you've got any specific goals, like things like better healthcare, optimal strategic goals that you want from an implementation. And it can also help you develop your implementation roadmap over a time frame and map that out over whatever period of time you want to take, document your milestones from there and just give you an overall picture. And this is a tool that you can access. It kind of gives you that Word document that you can kind of update, just useful for anybody that's working in policy or strategy or local organizations to give you a head start to document things. The other thing that we have are then the practical resources and services that you might need to be able to go through the process of an implementation. So again, it's sort of looking at what your current eHealth environment is, what you might need to do, then develop use cases for maybe clinical areas that you might want your initial implementation to start off with. And then looking at the actual architecture or approaches that you might want to use to implement SNOMED CT. And then the next step is, you know, considering there might be other artifacts, like Ian's mentioned, subsets or maps, extensions that you might want to create before you sort of implement your SNOMED CT enabled system. And then the final but probably most important step is the review when you're looking at your implementation. And there's different sort of maturity levels and frameworks that you can use to work out where your implementation is at. The next bit that we just want to talk about is the different approaches that can be used to implement SNOMED CT. So I think Ian's covered a few of these in terms of the examples he gave from the mapping. So the different use cases from there, but mainly SNOMED CT can be used to record that clinical information using SNOMED CT concept identifiers as a code system. It can be used as an interface terminology, so the display of clinical terms to capture and enter data. It can be used as an indexing system for reporting and clinical decision report and retrieval requirements. Like Ian said, as a common reference sort of terminology, using that support to communicate with different systems and exchange that clinical data. But also then as a dictionary to link with clinical guidelines and decision support. And then it can also be used as an extensible foundation to sort of develop new clinical meanings that might not be there in the other terminology. It can be used as an extensible foundation using the different relationships and concepts to build those clinical meanings that clinicians need to record. So this is just sort of an abstract view of an electronic health record, just to show a little bit where it might be implemented. So it would likely be implemented as a code system around the health records data store. So then, which then would relate to queries within the terminology, which is where in the terminology services where the extensible foundation, it would be implemented as, where the release files and everything are updated and installed. And then at the user interface is where you would see it as an interface terminology to capture, display the clinical information that you need. And then this would be also where you've got the retrieval aspect of the data that you need for the information that you might want to retrieve for patient care. And then it would then be implemented as a dictionary around health records again and terminology to query this information. And that's what it's used for, reporting and analytics and decision supports and guidelines. And then the final bit at the bottom, you can see is that with the exchange where it's used as a common sort of reference terminology, where it's exchanging information with other systems and applications. Okay, so when it comes to implementation approaches, it's kind of where do you start? What might you want to do? And I think one of the main things is that you will see a mixture of approaches used in many different implementations. So it's not a one size fits all. There's not a right or wrong. It will always depend on the use case of your implementation, the requirements, and the scope of that implementation. So for example, you might have one implementation that uses it as an interface terminology to display that clinical information about a particular diagnosis field. Or it might be used, like Ian was saying, as maps from like a drug dictionary to SNOMED CT to capture that data there. I think the key thing is that it's always going to be a review process. So you're looking at those benefits that this is going to give to patient care. And then the different approaches that you've got, you can always build upon, and it's just a continual sort of iterative cycle review of implementations. You kind of start where you can and what meets your requirements. Okay, so what are the benefits of SNOMED CT? So this is where we're looking at where is SNOMED CT used. So we're looking at sort of the topics that we've covered in terms of data entry and integration, that clinical information sharing, it's key, that we've got that electronic exchange of clinical data. But it can also be used for point of care analytics, so historical summaries, reporting and clinical decision support, but also used for population analytics. So analyses of the general population that's there to help you make decisions about what you might want to do from a treatment perspective. And then you've got management analytics and also research. And these are the kind of our stakeholder landscape, I suppose, the people that we hope will get value from that SNOMED CT implementation. So we've got our collaboration partners, which I think Ian obviously discussed a lot about, in terms of that we work with lots of different collaboration partners to make sure there's sort of great patient care, really, that it links with all the different standards. And then we've got our members of SNOMED who sort of hold the license, I suppose, for the member countries, and sort of distribute that and can also help develop the product as a whole. Then we've got the vendors and implementers of SNOMED CT using that in their systems, and then the care providers that are sort of using that to sort of in different care settings to provide that quality care to patients. And also then the patients that, if this information's in their records, it gives them that sort of self-care ability to know what's happening with their care and to be able to share it with their different care providers. And then we've got knowledge producers and researchers that will use this interoperable SNOMED CT embedded health information to help, develop evidence-based practice. But this can also be used by policymakers to help them drive their information, what they're collecting from there. So these are just a list of our collaborative partners that we've been working with. So this is from sort of different standards development organisations and professional clinical bodies that we're working with that are key for us from a SNOMED CT point of view. And then these are just sort of a summary of sort of benefits to sort of individuals, that we've got clinical information is recorded consistently. It can help electronic health records in terms of real-time decision support, and help drive evidence-based practice. And then the benefits to populations, so early identification of emerging health issues, I think like Ian's also touched on earlier with examples of the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the things that I wanted to sort of just highlight is when it's becoming to show the value of SNOMED CT, we've got a list of sort of case studies that have showed what the value of SNOMED CT has been for their organisations and where it's been used. So you can see from these sort of 10 case studies how it's been used for sort of data entry and integration, and sort of point of care analytics by different people. And this is available on the website, that you can read about all these different case studies and in a bit more detail to show how they've got that benefit from SNOMED CT. So now just a little bit for you about SNOMED International. So we're owned and governed by 48 member countries. So I think when it initially started out, we had about 9, but now we're up to a number of 48 member countries that help deliver and work with us in terms of SNOMED CT. And we're a not-for-profit organisation. So we're a virtual organisation and we're all across the world. So we all work remotely from far and wide, but with the headquarters in London. And then we've got membership fees that are based on countries' national wealth. So these are our 48 member countries, with France, who just recently joined, I think, and also Croatia up there. So the numbers are steadily growing. And then this is just to summarise the vision that we've got for SNOMED CTs, that clinical terminologies will be used globally, which will result in better health and improved patient outcomes, so supported by one language of health. And then these are the member benefits that we've got. So if you're a member of SNOMED International, you get the free use of SNOMED CT and related products, membership of the General Assembly, ability to create sort of your national extensions and translations, and access to the global community of other member countries. There's a free new member induction, and then we also have sort of education benefits, so the free courses, so a membership discount of 50% for any certification exams that anyone might take, and then 2 free certification enrolments per year. So how to learn more. So obviously we've got a lot of tutorials and education going on today, but we also run some courses that we've said here. So we've got the foundation course, which is the very first course that you'd say, which kind of tells you the how, what and why of SNOMED CT. And then we have our more advanced courses like the implementation course, that covers a really broad topic of what implementation knowledge you might need when working on implementations of SNOMED CT. Terminology services, which is sort of aimed at developers using APIs to be able to look at how they might query SNOMED CT. And then we have authoring level 1, which teaches you the basic authoring skills of content development of SNOMED CT. And it also prepares you for the certification exam for authoring level 1. And then authoring level 2 is the more advanced authoring skills and the more complex theory around authoring SNOMED CT content, and also prepares you for the authoring level 2 certification. So the foundation course tends to be the prerequisite of all the courses. And then you can go to the implementation course or terminology services or authoring. So as long as you've got the foundation course, you can move on to any of those, apart from the learning pathways at the bottom. So you don't have to have the foundation course to go to the learning pathways. They're sort of just ones to get you started, specifically like for developers and data analysts. There's a clinicians one. We know clinicians sometimes don't have an awful lot of time, so it's just to get them up to speed. And then the translators pathway was developed only recently, just because we know that if people are working on translations, they might not have time to take the foundation course, which is about 8 hours. So that was just a cut down version, just to help people get up and running if they're working on translations. Yeah, yeah. 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 So one of the other resources that you might find really useful is the implementation support portal. And this gives you sort of a lot of resources about sort of, so this is where you'll find the roadmap generator I talked about, but also the implementation process guidance and different documents, but also where you can get in touch with our implementation support team. So if you have any queries about an implementation you're working on or anything like that, you can contact them. There's their contact details in there as well. And then there's the SNOMED CT document library, which is an important source of information about anything to do with SNOMED CT. Overviews tend to be the ones that are just to get people started and give you a sort of a basic knowledge of SNOMED. And then there's specific guides like the editorial guide, which gives you a bit more detailed information. And then there's the specifications, which are more technical documents. So these are all available at snomed.org/doc. You can get to them there, but there's also past SNOMED CT Expo presentations as well. How else can you get involved as well in the SNOMED CT community? So we have some clinical reference groups. So that tends to look at sort of clinical areas of the content of SNOMED CT and looks at that it's there to meet the clinical specialty requirements to recording information in that area. There's the vendor marketplace. You can get involved locally as well as part of your members. So often countries will have a national release centre that you can go to talk about maybe your local needs in that country. We also run events. So the expos run every year, but there are business meetings that are held twice a year that are for particular sort of advisory and project groups to do with SNOMED CT. And then we do have a web series as well, which covers sort of the clinical web series. So where we've got clinicians that are using SNOMED CT come to present their sort of findings. Then we have sort of research webinars as well, where experts in the research field will discuss what they've been, how they've been using SNOMED CT, and also implementation web series where people sort of share their experience of SNOMED CT implementations. And then we have the regular meetings, which are like the clinical reference groups or advisory groups, and that can be found at the What's On This Week meetings from there. So thank you very much, everybody. So if you have any questions, please let me and Ian know.
Does anybody have any questions? No? You can ask us at
Yeah.
if you see us in Expo, grab hold of us. There's no questions online, so I think that's the end today. Thank you for coming. There's lots more to do. There are more education serious ones, but also the Expo. This was just to give you a rough starting point of when you go to other presentations and they mention concepts or descriptions or anything like that. Hopefully now we've put it into some form of context. And please, if you're really interested in the courses, please do them. They're very popular. As Kath said, the foundation course is only about 8 hours, it's modularized. It's really interactive. And it's a good starting point. And then we have the more advanced courses if you'd like. Okay, so thank you very much and have a really good Expo.